Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Ben Kinsley is joining me as co-host this evening. Ben, welcome. Haven't seen you in a while.
I know, it's been a little while since you've been on the air together.
Exactly. And we have a very special guest tonight. This is a first-timer on our show, Commissioner Michael Schirling, who is the Commissioner of Public Safety. And Michael, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great. We have a lot to talk about. I have more questions than we have time, so we'll just get through them as fast as we can. I thought just to start out, since this is sort of your first time on the show, and since some of the things that are being proposed that we're going to talk about later on impact the structure of public safety, I thought that you could talk about what the breadth of your responsibility is as commissioner, because I bet people would be surprised.
Sure. The Department of Public Safety is one of 12 cabinet-level departments in the executive branch of state government, and we've got embedded in the department the state police, which is the largest component, about half of the staff, the Division of Emergency Management, Division of Fire Safety, the Vermont Forensic Laboratory, the Vermont Crime Information Center, and a radio technology services group that actually maintains most of the state's radio communications technology, as well as running its own phone company, believe it or not.
Well, could you explain that for a few minutes? What does that mean?
The state gets phone service from a couple of different entities, but the public safety non-911 phone infrastructure is run by the team in the radio technology services group.
Oh, cool.
So
good for them.
It's an interesting construct.
Yeah. And so how does, I know you got something in Homeland Security, I'm sure, and then the Intelligence Center. How does Homeland Security, is it a separate unit or department?
Sure. The Homeland Security unit is now in emergency management. It was historically in the state police, and actually before that, it was in emergency management before. But now it's again a unit of emergency management, and the Intelligence Center is an extension of the state police. And there are a host of other unit level operations beyond the division and sort of large entities that I just went through that we could probably take an hour to go through all the various smaller components.
So there's quite a bit of information on your website talking about some of those different components that are part of the Department of Public Safety. One of the interesting things that was you guys worked on over the last year was accelerating modernization in law enforcement agencies. It was a report, I believe, that was published in August, and it's kind of interesting because we think about modernization and all kinds of different things, but normally think about technology, right? And not necessarily law enforcement is not the first thing you might think about.
Right, and technology is a component of that modernization strategy. That was actually work that began when I arrived in September of 19. I moved over from the Agency of Commerce, served there for about 3 years, and then came to public safety. And one of the first things we did was actually a similar exploration as to what we did at Commerce, where in order to set strategy for the near term, we looked at reports, white papers, studies, and things that inform strategy. In that case, that related to housing and community development policy and economic development policy, and a little bit of tourism as well. And public safety, a more finite sort of lane of travel to explore. But we went back 50 years and looked at studies that informed the organization of state assets, the organization of public safety assets, technology, the 911 system, and all kinds of different things. And from that, we applied a lens of looking at the way we deliver contemporary government. And one of the 4 areas that the governor has the cabinet focused on. We, in January, actually put forth the first iteration of a modernization strategy, which was in part responsive to work the legislature has come back to on a number of occasions, and in part reflective of those various studies that we uncovered, and in part just contemporary thinking around the way we organize our assets, the types of supports that we provide to county and municipal agencies, not only in law enforcement, but in the fire service, and to some extent in emergency medical services, although that component of government operations is actually in the health department. We have a robust intersection with emergency medical services as well.
So anyway, so picking back up, what were some of the key recommendations in that modernization report? Like, what were some of the big takeaways, knowing that that was a big project you guys have been working on for almost a year?
Sure. So we put forward a variety of recommendations and strategies around organizing state assets that relate to public safety, support for municipal and county public safety assets, modernization of technology, and modernizing the way that the state supports public safety operations. So, for example, we maintain computer networks that allow, in particular, law enforcement agencies to communicate and in a secure way, not only with us, but with National Crime Information Center computers and things like that. There's a reimbursement construct that goes with that. And what we're suggesting is simplifying the connectivity methods, modernizing the way those are done, and eliminating those charges to the greatest extent possible. One of the signature efforts is adoption of an updated computer-aided dispatch and records management system, which is the backbone system that allows calls to come in and ultimately for data to be gathered and then to be able to make data-driven decisions like we're doing on a day-to-day basis now with the COVID-19 epidemic, to be able to do that across all areas of operation. And then there are a few other components of the modernization strategy, organizing the state assets in a different way. For the better part of 50 years, we've been talking about moving the Department of Public Safety to an agency of public safety model, which is a little bit inside baseball for government, being a large department and an agency. But moving some of the other law enforcement components like criminal justice training, the 911 operations, and the three other law enforcement components beyond the state police, Department of Motor Vehicles, Division of Enforcement and Safety, the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement, and potentially liquor control, exploring whether it makes sense to put them under a unified umbrella. And again, these are conversations that have been happening for literally since before I was born. The first study we done was done the year before I was born.
I think I remember when I heard about this, I wrote you a very lengthy note about past feelings of those law enforcement agencies and the issues that we ran into, because it's a never-ending discussion. And that's what public safety was intended in the first place. That's why it was eventually the agency of public service. It's all of the public service entities. It wasn't state police only. Correct. Right. So and I don't think people really realize that. So I know, given everything that's been going on around the world, or around the nation, actually, especially here in the United States, there's a big issue, I would think, in the modernization about hiring practices, training and supervisory selections. And along with that, which I would find very interesting, is how you identify, because personnel was always my background, how do you identify the level of cultural awareness somebody might have and their commitment to fair and impartial policing? Because that's sort of a hard thing to pull out of somebody in an interview.
It is, that's true. And one of the questions just a moment ago actually related to modernization strategy dated in August. So important for viewers to note that we put forth this larger construct in January, and then in August, or actually in June, in response to events that were going on nationally and conversations that had accelerated in the legislature, we put forward a more nuanced plan around fair and impartial policing in particular, that ranged from hiring, which is what you're talking about now, to how do we select supervisors, what does a hiring panel look like, what kinds of policy are necessary, what does supervision look like, what kinds of accountability mechanisms should exist statewide. hiring component that you just mentioned, it is you're in part when we're screening candidates in the 21st century. It's in part what you know. It's in part what your experience has been. So we know that people that have experience working in other locations and other countries that have that varied background bring different perspective to the table. So that's an advantage. People who have learned other languages, that's an advantage. And one of the ways that you help to screen for cultural competency, or in many cases, the capacity to have cultural competency, because you may not have
that's a good point,
immediately,
right?
And I'm not sure anyone's ever fully culturally competent. It's a journey, right? As you go through life and you become more competent as you go
with
through,
experience, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's actually an end game there. But one of the ways you do that is to involve the community in the hiring process. And there are a variety of departments that have done that historically. We now have new civilian staff on board as equity advisors, as co-directors of fair and impartial policing, and we're looking to expand those efforts. And having the community embedded in the process itself is essential, not only for hiring, but as you're selecting supervisors and going through that process. And then probably most importantly, as you're selecting chief executives, whether that's in law enforcement or in any other government service, having the community involved in those conversations. It already happens, of course, for elected officials at the ballot box, but for appointed officials, there's a role as well.
Are you working with Susanna Davis closely, who is the governor's, she's been on the show, Equity, and I forget her title. She's a director of Equity and Diversity, she's fabulous. We had her on. She's very good.
Yes, we do work with her. I wouldn't overstate how much, because she's pulled in so many different directions that
that's true.
We call her with great frequency, but she's got a lot going on. There's a lot of work in this arena.
And she has a lot of deadlines. I don't know how she's going to do it, but I wish her luck. She's great. But I'm assuming she's probably involved in this because it's so important.
Yes, on a variety of levels. And as I mentioned, we've hired staff in as well to act in a similar role, with an eye toward specifically working on these efforts through a public safety and a law enforcement lens.
Good for you. Good for you.
So it seems like the next link in this chain of, talking about community policing, what's appropriate, how does a police force or a police department reflect the community and community values? It seems like, the hiring process starts with the hiring process, right? It then puzzle seems to be the actual policies that a department puts in place. So use of force policies and whatnot. How do you set an effective and appropriate use of force policy?
A technical question. I would start by saying the thing that goes in between hiring and policy is training. So training people, and often it's sort of chicken or egg, because you're in part training to policy, but training is an essential piece to give people the building blocks to be able to interpret and then execute that policy. So let me start by saying there are a few policies that are sort of front page news, whether that's use of force or fair and impartial policing. Those are sort of well known that they exist. What folks probably would not readily be aware of is the fact that there are dozens, in some cases, approaching 100 additional policies that guide operations. So, and many of those policies flow from case law, they flow from existing statutes. So there is a framework of operations for law enforcement, not only in Vermont, but in many other places, that is fairly well established. There's not a lot of sort of leeway in the way things operate. It's far more regimented than almost any other job you can imagine. And it was actually striking to me going to Commerce for the years that I was there, how different the operating environment was in a state government entity that was not in the enforcement business, and how few policies there were. There were the requisite ones, but not every granular detail of what you do has some policy associated with it. So with that as the background, how do you get to the current state of a use of force policy, which is at the moment the sort of top of mind for most people? The use of force by law enforcement is governed by the Fourth Amendment. Anytime force is used, it is a seizure of a person. So it's governed by search and seizure law. And the courts had begun, like in many other areas, laying down pretty significant guidelines around that, starting in the 60s and then through the 80s, adding even more detail to that, both at a federal level and on a state level. So that's the top level guiding premise around use of force is used and when it's permissible and under what circumstances. And then at the operational level, we weave in what tools are available. So we're constantly looking for tools to de-escalate things, skills to be able to prevent the need to use some kind of force. And then there are the actual physical tools. So we're constantly adding tools to the toolbox as they emerge. I can remember through my career going from carrying straight batons and mace, which was notoriously unreliable and no one ever used, to moving to a natural-based pepper spray and different kinds of controlled utility tools. And so we have this array of things that are woven into the policy. When can you use them? Under what circumstances? What are the appropriate decision points? And then you physically train on how to use all those things and apply that policy. What's really important to note at the back end is how infrequently that happens. So state police, for example, the largest law enforcement agency in Vermont, with if we were fully staffed at 332 troopers, responds to about 125,000 events a year. And I'll ask you the question: how many times is force beyond compliant handcuffing? So handcuffs have to be used for every arrest by policy. Right. Again, another policy. How many times is force beyond that used? So everything from an arm bar, sort of holding someone in a restraint technique in order to handcuff them, all the way through a firearm being discharged to someone. How many times out of 125,000 responses would you guess that force is used?
I bet it's under 24, right?
No, not quite that low.
Not quite that low.
No,
under 100.
I was going 10%, but that's about.
I was going. Yeah.
Under 24 would be great. It
really?
In 19, the last full year of numbers, we have 183 times. Okay, so 183 out of 125,000 responses.
So it's about 1/10 of 1%.
Right.
And then add to that many responses have multiple people involved. So a low number would be an average of 2 per response. So 250,000 encounters in a year. It's really higher than that, but let's say 250,000 for the sake of argument. 183 times that force beyond compliant handcuffing is used. Now, that's not to diminish the importance of those encounters where force is used, because they're really important and significant because of the severity, not because of the frequency, but they are relatively infrequent events.
Right. Doesn't sound the way the press covers it, does it? It's when you hear all of the, which is some of these things that you hear are just really awful. And that's where you get attention on the state police. I was going to ask you though, when you were talking about training and cultural awareness, does that philosophy at the training academy go through to local police, municipalities, correction officers? It's not just state police, I would assume, correct?
It does. One of the advantages to training in Vermont is it's a single academy for all training. And while there are arguably a variety of things that if we were to invest more, and I think that's one of the important points that going back into the next legislative session, we've got to talk about how to invest more to accelerate the kinds of training that we want to be able to do in the future. We have the talent there to deliver, even on a shoestring budget, which they have now, some of the best training that's available in the country right now. And that starts with really setting that culture that if you think you're getting into a job that is what you see in movies and on television, you're in the wrong place.
Right.
It is a community caretaking function. It is in the 21st century, it is much closer to social work than it is to traditional 1950s
Right.
and 60s and 70s law enforcement. Just the facts, please. Although our folks are very good at those kinds of technical investigations, that's not the majority of what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, we used to have Tony, when he was chief in Montpelier, Tony Fakos. He was my go-to law enforcement guy, and he would always, because he's close by, and he'd come over, and I loved him anyway. And now, of course, he's at DMV. But he talked constantly about the police jobs changing to social workers and the mental health issues and how they have to work closely with mental health professionals to get control of situations sometimes. And they started this Team 2, which I think is around Vermont, where they bring in social workers, mental health professionals, and they work as a team with law enforcement to learn what needs to be done. And he said that that's really made quite a difference.
That's exactly
because
right.
How do they know what to deal with on a mental health issue? I mean, that's a whole other training.
I skipped over that in the modernization strategy. One of the key tenets is to expand the number of field service mental health workers that we have working out of
Right,
barracks
right,
and police departments, and that has been incredibly successful for two
right.
decades in Vermont. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to invest in that at a state level to get it statewide. This year, the legislature did agree and make that investment of just over $500,000 to expand that program from 2 barracks to 9 barracks.
Good for them.
Then we'll work from there to expand further.
That's great. And just one more question, I'll turn it over to Ben. We have not heard during COVID, not very little about opioid addiction. And I have a feeling it's not going down, is it? Particularly because of the quarantine and staying home. And I think, if anything, I'd be thrilled if it's going down, but I bet it isn't.
It's not going down substantially. Yeah. The overdose numbers are hovering. They go up and down a little bit over the last 7 months. And the new numbers actually came out just a couple of days ago, but they're sitting in a pending file. I haven't had a chance to read them yet.
Yeah. But we did 8 shows on, for Jolinda LeClaire asked us to do 8 shows on each segment of the whole process, training, addiction, and how the doctors approach it, the whole being. And it was pretty enlightening listening to all these people we had on the shows about how bad this is here in Vermont.
It's been almost a decade now. It was 2011 when I was in Burlington, and we identified the spikes in overdoses and crime and the ancillary things associated with the epidemic that had begun to emerge. And that was early 2011. So we're coming up on a full decade of this.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really tough issue that's made even tougher when you have people that are stuck at home and not able to go out and do a whole lot. So
it's making some of us crazy.
Yeah. Speaking of mental health.
Yes, exactly.
So I want to revisit use of force policies a little bit. That's obviously the thing that is in the news right now. People are concerned about, and you see these news clips. Not so much from Vermont, but from other parts of the country that you just look at it and you're like, how did an officer react in the way that it seems that they did in this clip, right? In this video clip, and of course everyone's got a camera now, so it's. You see these. It still may be 1 in a million, but you see the clips now because it happened. Someone happens to be standing there and recording it.
You say 1 in a million. There are actually there's about 1 million police officers active in the United States, and there are about 1 million encounters every day between police and the public. There's 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. That's a whole other topic. But you see these things, and some of them are head scratchers as to how they could happen, especially today with the training techniques, the tools, the nature of the policies that are out there, the models. I mean, there are three large organizations in the country: the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Police Executive Research Forum, and the National Police Foundation, that are think tanks that are pushing forward constantly on how to improve operations in an often unpredictable landscape of American policing, which on any given day could range from you're dealing with increasing numbers of mental health calls where you're essentially a healthcare provider in some respects, all the way through school shootings and active shooters and domestic terrorism and just an enormous array of things. And one of the things I think that contributes to the difficulty in getting it right in some places is a lack of recognition of that scope and depth of what we're asking of police officers in the 21st century. So if you're an agency that's not mindful that we're asking you on one hand to be able to compassionately deal with a 6-year-old survivor of sexual violence, and on the other hand, be able to go through a door on a search warrant for a violent offender, that we don't have an option but to go through. I hate to make parallels to the Breonna Taylor tragedy because that was a search warrant that has taken on a different connotation. Right. But you got to be able to do that entire spectrum of things. You have to be able to deliver that service. Well, hiring, this goes back to hiring people that can operate across that entire spectrum with the level of deftness and skill necessary to be an expert at both ends is pretty difficult to achieve. It's like asking a physician to be both a pediatrician and an oncologist. It's really hard to do both things. So finding operational constructs that can allow you to put the right resources at the right scene at the right time is part of how you operate a contemporary police department. And one of the challenges associated with having 18,000 of them around the country and a vast majority having under 10 employees is it's difficult to have the resources necessary to operate in that spectrum. That's why regionalized safety services, which going back to those studies and reports that we talked about during that second question, that date all the way back to 1969, saying regionalizing services, aggregating the way we do business, not making it so that there isn't local control, but creating mechanisms where the key things have operational consistency and you decrease the variation of results is essential in the way we move forward in modernizing things. So all of this ultimately relates in one way or another to the kinds of things that we're talking about, the modernization initiatives. How do things go badly? How do you make sure that things go well? It's all related. Right. So I may not have directly answered your question because I'm not even sure we got to the end of the nugget there.
No, you did.
Well, no, and that's a great point because that's because what we're looking for, right, or hoping to look for is consistency in how situations are handled, right? Whether it's the way that use of force is applied, whether it's the way that fair and impartial policing is applied. What you really want, you want to remove these fringe cases as much as possible. You want consistency.
And people have to remember these are decisions that are made within a split second. I mean, something's in front of you and you have to react, and you don't have much time to sit and think about it. You just do, and you hope the training kicks in appropriately.
Well, that's actually a good point, because part of me wonders when you see these failures of, I hate to call them failures, but you see these failures in the process where something goes wrong. And you wonder, is that a hiring issue? Is that a training issue? Is that a policy issue? Or is it some combination of all of those?
And we do postmortems and case analyses when something does go wrong and look at all of those things. So actually every use of force that all 183 of those events from 2019 and roughly the same number now in 2020 get reviewed by a committee of experts that looks at the policy, looks at the training, looks at the outcome, looks at the conduct of the officers. And was there a violation of the policy? Was there something that was done wrong? Or more often, is there something that we can learn from it so we can minimize the number of times that something goes that way again in the future? Because when force is used, it's not good for anyone. It's not good for the person force is used on. It's dangerous for the officer. Officers get hurt. Part of the evolution of the tools, both those verbal de-escalation tools and the actual physical tools, is designed with an eye toward, we're in government, so we're trying to minimize expenses to taxpayers. That's a piece of operations that doesn't usually get front page news because it's, again, inside baseball. But how do we reduce the number of workers' comp cases?
Right.
And reduce the number of times people are out on injuries, reduce the number of lawsuits because someone thinks that force was used excessively. Those are all risk mitigation that are important to the way that we operate as well. They're the more technical components, but that's all part and parcel of day-to-day decision-making in operations.
You and I talked before we started videotaping. I went to an event this last weekend and I ran into a couple of retired troopers and troopers and municipal officers. They were not happy with the use of force bill. And do you know what made them unhappy? Why they were unhappy with it? I'm sure you've listened to them and heard them out, but why were they unhappy?
Well, I haven't talked to any retirees specifically about you're talking about S119.
Yes, right.
Passed.
Right.
S119 creates a statutory construct for the use of force, where historically we've been guided by a robust amount of case law that guides how use of force is done. Vermont has opted to create a statutory overlay to that. I think the frustration is that there wasn't a lot of time to testify and to really dig into the nuances of a very complicated area of operations. We're working now hard to implement what's been passed in 119 to create policy that flows from it, to create training that flows from it, and to also identify areas where we might ask the legislature to make improvements or clarifications. And I think there is, if there's a frustration, it's that there just wasn't enough time to hear all the details.
If they're willing to listen,
or from stakeholders as well.
Right. Well, if there isn't a time, maybe this January or so, this next legislative session, they may have the opportunity to revisit it because it's a new biennium, so they could tweak it if they had to. Yeah, because they were. I didn't quite get the nuance. I didn't quite get what they were saying. They were just saying we don't like it, and I was trying to get them to be specific, but they weren't. So that's not helpful.
Well, there are three areas of substantial alteration to the existing standard. One is there have been there's additional language that's been added, so additional words, and that may sound trivial, but the words make a huge difference when you're interpreting what you're supposed to do, and ultimately when the courts have to interpret whether what you did was appropriate or not. So we have to figure out what those words mean and how to, and I don't say that facetiously. Some of them are defined, and some of them are not. So we actually have to figure out what they mean in the context, and we're working actively to do that. The second area is the law. It creates a retrospective look back at what happened leading up to the use of force. There is a component of that in the existing standard, but it's unclear. Again, this is a language issue, and it's going to take some time, and it may take years before the courts actually tell us what it means. So we may ultimately get some things wrong, but there'll be some assessment of the events that lead up to the use of force, and we don't have all the questions completely ferreted out yet because the language in the bill changed right up until the last day of the session, but we're not exactly sure how to interpret that yet. So that's going to be a challenge. And then the last piece that will be, not that these are the exclusive challenges, but these are the ones we've identified and we're actively working to find the solutions to. The last one is that as written, the law tells us that we need to take into account someone's mental health, their substance use, really anything that might cause an altered mental status. And we observed to the committee as they were talking about this, and we still have this concern, but again, we're working hard to try to operationalize this. We're not entirely sure how to do that. It is really hard, even in an emergency department with all of the requisite diagnostic tools to determine what the underlying cause of someone's altered mental status is. So, for example, I am known to have, this is an example, an underlying mental health diagnosis. And I'm acting out in an unusual, potentially violent way in my front yard. That may be the cause of it. But what also may be the cause of that is something criminogenic. I've chosen to do something bad. It may be that I just fell down the stairs and I have a closed head injury. It may be that I've just become a type 2 diabetic and my sugar insulin balance is off, and that's causing an altered mental status. It's a very difficult thing to operationalize in the heat of a moment in the middle of an emergency response. So that's the third area where we have concerns, and we're on the record with all those things. But again, we're given orders, we execute those orders, and that's what we're working to do right now. And we may have additional questions for the legislature come January, and we'll do our best.
Because the governor didn't sign this into law; he just let it pass without his signature. Correct? Am I right about that?
That is correct.
Yeah.
119 was not signed.
Yeah. Right. So
For
that
some
should give them a clue. Yeah.
Some of those same concerns about
I bet.
How do you know for sure that someone is experiencing a mental health crisis? Obviously, there's some key things that you might look for, like, is the person making sense when they talk? Is it, are they weaving together a cohesive narrative? Like, there's some things there that you can tell, but a lot of times you can't. And how do you know for sure that someone is experiencing a mental health crisis or just some other sort of form of crisis?
And I left out the second half of that challenge, which is, well, let's say we show up and I'm on the front lawn and my wife says he's experiencing a mental health break. This happens every 6 months. I know what it is, but this time he's picked up a chair and he's swinging it at people, and we can't get the chair away from him. The law says we have to take that into consideration. I'm not sure how to change it. It's not like the tool set changes. If ultimately what we have to do is subdue that person in order to get them the treatment they need, we don't have a different tool set to bring to bear. So we have to figure out how to operationalize that as well.
Right, because even if they are having a mental health episode, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not a danger to themselves or someone else.
Well, if he's holding the chair, that's a tool to hurt somebody right there. So they have to stop it.
Right. What also, and for viewers, I think it's important to know what also was, we did a chance to really unpack in the conversation, in part because the legislative session was just so interrupted by COVID and there were such short timelines, is that we do very much take into account someone's underlying challenges or conditions, but that is in different sets of policy. So we have mental health response policies. We have responses to people who are inebriated policies. Those things are all taken into account, and there are ways that are crafted where we deal with those things. Great. In the heat of the moment when they're presenting, as you said, a danger, we're going to have to try to figure out how to weave in this use of force construct into that decision making, and it's going to be a substantive challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I've been taking shooting lessons, and we had a discussion, and the first half hour of every session is talking about safety. We've been talking; it's just kind of drilled into you over and over again. And the thing that he was telling us, the instructor, was about when somebody has a knife and they're holding it and they're running at you. There is a point at which if you shoot, you have to stop the momentum. So if you shoot too close, the perpetrator could just keep going and stab you. And I think I was just thinking about the guy who was shot in the church years ago down in Bennington, I think. People were just, went crazy about it without realizing that he presents a danger to himself. And no, it's not just a knife. It's something that if applied properly can really kill the officer or anybody else who's in the way.
Yeah, and one of the things that concerned, you bring up another great point, one of the things that concern the legislature and concerns us as well is that historically, law enforcement was called to try to prevent people from harming themselves. We still get called to those kinds of calls, but that response methodology has evolved quite a bit. So let's say you're barricaded in your house and you're threatening to hurt yourself and you're armed with a firearm. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we probably would have just waited you out. We would stay there until you came out. We would have crisis negotiator. We may now do that for a period of time, but now we also may choose to back away from that scenario completely and literally leave in hopes that de-escalates, because nothing good comes from us going through that door and trying to disarm you.
Right.
And there isn't a threat to anyone else. So they were trying to get in part at that with this piece of legislation. That is part and parcel again of the existing operating environment.
Because you can get them later when things have calmed down. The same with the high speed chase. If you know who it is, let them go home and pick them up there.
Surprising number of departments have no chase policies now. Like they won't chase.
Right?
Yeah, they won't chase someone who's speeding.
Huh.
Right. More police officers are killed in motor vehicles than by firearms every year.
Oh, that's terrible. So have you had any discussions about defunding the police? I love those young people with the signs and the yelling. Has that come up at all in the legislature? I hope not.
It has come up peripherally, but we haven't had any direct testimony related to that. The reality of funding for law enforcement in Vermont in particular is that it's not particularly well funded.
No, for sure.
And that's because we're a small state and we have competing interests and competing things that need money. And I'm not complaining at all. I'm just making an observation that we could invest more in training. We could invest more in recruitment. We could invest more in technology. And it's more a resource issue than anything. But I think going forward from this point, because policing is top of mind, there are opportunities to have those conversations and to ensure that especially the General Assembly that's got the purse strings is mindful of the opportunities to invest in various areas to continue to improve outcomes.
From what we hear, 2021 is going to be a killer from a budget perspective, because that's when the impact of COVID will really hit. Because this year's budget, there was some extra money or I don't know, some rainy day funds that were used, but next year will be pay the piper, and it may not be too pleasant.
Yeah, I think we successfully avoided having to tap the rainy day funds for this fiscal year as a result of that nice $1.2 billion investment by the federal government. But there's no guarantee there's money coming for 22.
Right. Well, they're still arguing about it.
So
for any federal lawmakers listening, states and local government need another infusion of cash.
Exactly.
Please do it. Yes.
Yeah.
So something on that defunding the police movement we see kind of across the country and in some cities cities and towns in Vermont. My understanding of the movement is less about it's not so much punishing, and I hate to use that term, punishing police departments for performance or lack of performance or whatever it is. It's more about moving, at least in my understanding, moving towards a more preventative model of community engagement. It's instead of spending money on, police officers who are the first responders, move that funding into more preventative programs, things like after school programs and community centers and things like that, and some of that goal can be reached through additional training, I think. And this is one of the areas where I think Vermont's ahead of the curve on is giving officers more tools. And you even talked about, Michael, in the beginning of how, police officers are acting more and more like social workers today than they were 10 years ago, even. So kind of fitting that already.
So law enforcement leaders in Vermont have been advocating for these kinds of diverse investments for almost 20 years now. And what's fascinating to me is now these ideas have traction, but you can go back to my public comments when I was chief in Burlington starting in 2008, and even when I was an area commander as a lieutenant 5 years before that. talking about the need to invest more in street level services in mental health and drug prevention. Mayor Weinberger once asked, if you're going to make an investment to reduce crime in the city, what would it be? I said early childhood education. You got to play the long game.
Right.
We can keep throwing money at incarceration, and you can't arrest your way out of problems. We've got it. And if you look at our modernization strategy, the last page is a criminal justice and public health construct that is designed to deliver exactly this. Invest at the bottom end, education and prevention, then invest your next best dollar, outreach and intervention, so street outreach models, crisis teams, those kinds of things. Then once you've got disorder or crime, alternative sanctions, the oldest version being diversion, but restorative justice panels, community justice centers, municipal ticketing, alternatives to putting people in the very expensive and lengthy and sometimes ineffective back end of the justice system. And then finally reserve the back end of the system for folks that need it, and only when the other things have failed. The key is to have accountability at every one of those levels. So you got to be able to deliver them with consistency for consistent outcomes. You have to measure those outcomes. And we've been talking about this with law enforcement leading that conversation for literally 15, 20 years. And now that finally has traction. And the frustrating part for me is there's a thread of blaming law enforcement for the position that we're now in, when the reality from where I sit is this was put on us in part. We've failed to deliver. I've said this on a host of occasions. Deinstitutionalization in the mental health system is the biggest piece of failed public health policy in history. The absolute right thing to do: get folks out, treat them in the community, have a better, more humane approach to this. Completely poorly executed. There was a false promise of we're going to reinvest those dollars in street level supports and alternative kinds of mechanisms. Very little of that ever happened.
Never happened.
No, never happened, right?
Yep. Yeah.
And now we've reinstitutionalized many of those people in jails.
Right.
Both in Vermont, but even more strikingly in other places around the country. It's a tragedy, and the frustrating part is we're being blamed for that. When, again, you look at law enforcement leaders all the way through 60 Minutes segments from a decade ago. I remember seeing a sheriff on 60 Minutes saying, "You got to help me. My jail is full of people who have mental illness, and we got to come up with a better way of doing this."
They used to have group homes back in the day when I was in Tarrytown, New York, and they would come to our church service, and that seemed to work very well. Is that something that would be part of this fix, or is something that didn't work out in the long run?
I don't actually know the answer to that question. I would defer to my contemporaries in the Department of Mental Health for which particular interventions are the best based on.
That just seemed to work for me. They had each group home everybody was on the same level of mental illness, so that they all sort of got along and understood each other. And they come to church with us, they'd have coffee hour with us, and we just thought it was great. And so did they. And that was being in the community, but then going home to a monitored, living at home. But anyway, I hope that. So when you're talking long term, what do you see? Especially if there's momentum, you've got to keep that up. Where do you see us coming to a place where you say we're here? I mean, this is the way it should be.
I don't know exactly what that end game is. If I knew that, I would be carrying around a Nobel Prize, and I don't have one of those. Where I hope we're going is for us to look at the delivery of public safety services more broadly in many of the ways that we've described. I could give you countless examples of things we've done over the years. When the opiate epidemic really took hold in Burlington, 2012-ish, simultaneously, we started a street outreach intervention program, and Rutland started their, oh my gosh, I just had it at the tip of my tongue. their initiative that Jim Baker started, Project Vision.
Oh, yes,
And
Jim, right.
one of our strategies was we went to every door in the city. We knocked on every single door. We brought public health nurses with us. We brought corrections officers with us. We brought social workers with us. We brought the street outreach teams with us, and we went to every single door and we delivered a letter that came from me, TJ Donovan, who was the state's attorney at the time, Bill Sorrell was the attorney general, and Tris Coffin was the U.S. attorney. And it said, listen, if you're facing addiction or problems, call this number. And it was for the street outreach team. If you know somebody who needs help, call this number. If you need help dealing with drug dealing in your neighborhood, call this number. And oh, by the way, if you're a drug dealer, we're coming. So please stop. And but the point being, we're not playing this hard and fast tactic. We will come and get you and sweep you up if you're a drug dealer. It'll take a little time, but the idea being we're telling you up front, come on, knock it off. You're killing the community. It had that portion had some effect, but the front end portions had tremendous effect. We had lots of people calling and getting help. And I think we mitigated. I can't imagine how bad the epidemic would have been in those early years if we hadn't been doing creative things like that. And
I bet it was
those
enlightening.
Things don't get a lot of play.
I bet it was enlightening for you and the folks who were with you to see what's behind some of those doors. Because I'm involved with Central Vermont Home Health and Hospice, and I went on a tour with one of the nurses. And I always say I live in a bubble because I don't see some of the stuff that you see behind those doors. Whoa.
If I can put in a plug here, you hit on a perfect point. If you are a Vermonter who's never spent a day out with law enforcement on a ride along, and you're interested in criminal justice policy and you're interested in what's going on, if you're a legislator and you're listening and you haven't been on a ride along, I cannot encourage you strongly enough to reach out to local law enforcement or the state police and set one up. And tell them that the Commissioner of Public, you heard the Commissioner of Public Safety say I should go do a ride along. It is enlightening.
Yeah.
It's enlightening to see the challenges that Vermont faces that aren't front page news, and it's enlightening to see the professionalism that law enforcement in Vermont brings to the table.
My cousin was in the Marines and then was in the police force in Sarasota, Florida. And he came up to visit and he was blown away by the fact that our officers ride by themselves. They don't go anywhere in Sarasota without two-man team or two-man-woman team, whatever. And he just couldn't believe that we send our officers out in rural communities by themselves.
We're pretty lucky here. It's quite a long time ago, 10 or 12 years ago now, two police officers from Burlington moved to South Florida. They happened to be married and they started working for a sheriff's department. And they came back a year or so later and we said, well, what's the big difference? They said, everything's different. We get in the car and we're going only to in-progress calls. So burglary in progress, robbery in progress, stabbing just occurred, shooting just occurred. That's all they do. They don't go to anything that's a late report, a vandalized mailbox, a late reported burglary. We said, so how do you take lunch or how do you take a meal? They're like, you just have to stop and someone else will handle those calls. They just keep going. It's like living in a different world.
Yeah. Well, we like it the way it is, and we're glad you're coming to Berlin, Commissioner. We heard that rumor. We're loving it.
It's a true story. You're going to save the taxpayers $several million doing it that way too.
We love it. Thank you. Ben, how much time do we have left now? Because maybe we could ask the commissioner to say a few final words.
Well, we've got about 8 minutes left, so I think
we do. All right, then let's ask questions.
One or two more questions. I do want to make sure we get to a question. We do get to something I'm sure a lot of people are wondering about. How do we square some of these events that we see in the news? Where you see a clip of an incident that happens, and you're wondering how does that happen, and then nothing, like it goes through the court systems, it goes through the appropriate review policy or whatever, and it comes out and nothing changes, nothing happens, and people are looking at that and going, how did nothing happen, or nothing change from this incident? Because it just looks wrong on so many levels. You know,
that's a great question.
How do we rectify that, I guess, is my question.
Well, I can't speak to, it's really hard, I guess, to speak to things that happen out of state because I don't know all of the nuances of what their legal system looks like. I mean, you look at something like George Floyd, and we're just horrified.
Yeah.
And there are other things that have occurred where you see police officers instantaneously fired or arrested, and we're just horrified. You know, there's 1 million officers in the United States. There's going to be a small cross section that are bad at what they do, that slip through the hiring process, or an agency has a bad hiring process, or a bad training process, or bad policy, or bad supervision. Any one of those things can cause a catastrophe. I'm going to guess that there were a variety of those things that created a confluence of events that caused something like George Floyd to happen. I mean, it's inconceivable how that can happen. And then there are mistakes at various levels. We've seen police officers get nervous and shoot someone going for their wallet. A catastrophic mistake, but clearly that person not cut out to do work, and potentially criminally charged as well. And then there are other things that are more ambiguous, lower level mistakes, decisions made without the benefit of having all the information or without the benefit of hindsight. So really squaring the things there's an array of different explanations for horrible events that happen. And among our primary jobs is to mitigate those things from happening, to try to eliminate them as best as possible. We're reasonably lucky in Vermont. We don't have too many catastrophic events that happen, but there are mistakes made. We make mistakes every day. That is the nature of humans doing work. Right. We try to learn from them and move on, and hopefully the impact of those mistakes is relatively small. Some of them are not. Some of them are substantive, and there has to be disciplinary action. What I would also observe that, and this is a challenge, there is discipline taken against police officers all the time, and that's not always public facing. Most of the time, it's not.
Shouldn't be.
And I think one of the things we have to figure out is how to be more transparent, but without giving up their rights to as employees, and without giving up their right to due process. And I'm not trying to sound obstructionist at all. I think we need to move in the direction of a level of transparency there, not the inverse. I'm just observing that it has to be done in balance, and it can't be done with a mob mentality like we've seen certain places around the country, and unfortunately, I think in Vermont as well.
Yep. I was going to ask you about that, what's happening, or it seems we haven't heard much about what's in Burlington, although I think, is the tent city still up? That's kind of gone away?
The tent city is no longer there, and we don't comment much on local matters.
Yeah, okay, so it was really up to the Burlington police force to handle that, correct?
Yes.
They don't call you in.
As a Burlington resident, I have opinions, but as the Commissioner of Public Safety, I do.
Okay, I respect that for sure. Yeah. The same thing that happened, which bothered me a lot, was what happened at the State House. And I felt we were honoring the police officers. And fortunately, there were several of your officers in plain clothes there that I knew. So as the crowd on the other side of the sidewalk got really out of hand, I felt fairly comfortable because I knew those guys were there. So I hung around them more. But it was really, for us older folks, pretty scary. I was looking for, how do you get out of here? You know, what do I do if this happens, if that happens? It was a first in Vermont, to me anyway, at that level.
Yeah, was that the dueling protests?
No, this was the law enforcement, defund the police, Black Lives Matter. There was a couple of hundred of young kids. They were all young kids mostly. And then on the other side of the sidewalk on the lawn were, folks like me. I was probably the oldest there, but 30, 40-year-olds there to honor the police. But they had to end the event early because it was looking like it was going to end sad, as my mother would say. So they left early. But I think this is something that's going to happen in Vermont, and we're going to have to. It's not the Vermont way for sure, but it's
No,
a
we
new
certainly
way.
we don't have a track record of disruptive,
No,
violent
no,
protest in Vermont. We have a pretty good track record there,
yeah,
and again, missing from the conversation is facilitated by law enforcement ensuring that people have a wide berth and have
right.
a safe platform to
Yeah.
do that, even when they're protesting.
Yeah, well,
Law
we
enforcement.
encourage that. We encourage that because it's their right under the First Amendment. But they took it a little to a level that I wasn't sure if it was crossing over or not. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I think there's a lot of anger out there, like
yeah,
frustration, seeing some of the events that have played out on the national stage, and then in some cases, I would say looking for an outlet for some of that anger and frustration locally. Looking for outlets locally, and some of them, it's okay to be angry and frustrated, and I think a lot of people are. I mean, everyone should be angry at some of the things that we've seen, but let's figure out how to fix it, right?
right. And present your
Exactly.
arguments in a constructive way. Anyway, Commissioner, we really thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I know you've had a busy. How long have you been in this position? I didn't ask you in the beginning.
Not very long.
Exactly.
Not even 13, just over a year, 13
Oh,
months.
really? Right before COVID? Oh my God.
September, and COVID was March 8th.
March. Oh, well.
Well, we really started talking about COVID in February, but it arrived in Vermont on March 8th.
Well, you picked a great time, but we're glad you're there. So thank you for coming on. If there's anything you'd like to share with our viewers, let me know. We'll put you on. And Ben, thanks for joining us tonight. Thank our viewers for tuning in again. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.